All right. Today I'm going to be talking about the architecture of Politeia, which is this new governance system that Decred just launched. So before we get into kind of how we built it, let's talk about the motivations for why we built it. As many of you know, Decred has a hybrid proof of work, proof of stake consensus model that allows you, if you own Decred, to lock that Decred up, stake it, and participate in the Decred governance. So 10% of our block reward is set off to the side and put into a network treasury. And right now, that network treasury is controlled by the team that launched Decred, but Politeia is our effort to essentially hand control that network treasury over to the Decred stakeholders. And so we needed a system that we could use for tracking of public records and the discourse around those records in a manner that is transparent, verifiable, versioned, and has a minimal on-chain footprint. So if you look at kind of some software that's already out there that you might think could be used for something like this, you have something like Reddit, which is a great platform for having users submit ideas, having discussions around those ideas, but it's a centralized web app, right? So there's no way to verify the validity of that data. Whoever controls the server can basically change the data as they please. And then you have something like Git, which is a popular source control software in the software development world that allows you to track changes to code bases over time and gives you a bunch of tools for interacting with those changes. But the thing about Git is that it's easily manipulated. The timestamps for the Git commits, which is when you save a specific version of a code base, those can be changed basically at the push of a button. And so you can't necessarily trust that data of Git itself. And then you have something like, well, we could just store all of the data on chain, right? That would work. It would create transparent, verifiable, versioned source of data, but that gets into leading to a tremendous amount of blockchain bloat. So you really want to minimize the amount of data you store on chain. Basically, the larger the blockchain, the more expensive it is to run a node, and the number of nodes in your network is directly proportional. It's one of the measures of decentralization. So we wanted to basically minimize the amount of data that we're storing on chain. So what we really wanted was a combination of all of these different solutions, and that's essentially what we built with Politeia. It is an off-chain data store with a Reddit-like interface to enable proposal submissions and community discussions around those submissions. It uses Git on the back end for versioning of the data, so you can track how the data has changed over time. All of the proposal data is cryptographically timestamped onto the Decred blockchain so that you can verify the authenticity of that data. And we make all of the Politeia data publicly available by regularly backing it up to a public GitHub repo. So this presentation is going to dive into the nuts and bolts of how Politeia works. But before we talk about Politeia, one of the core components is DCR time, which is DCR time is some software that we built that is a blockchain-based timestamping service that can be used to verify the authenticity of data over time. And the way it works is essentially, if you're not familiar with what a cryptographic hash function is, it is just a function that enables you to take a variable length input and it produces a fixed length output. So that string of numbers and letters that you see on the screen, that's an example of a hash. And hash functions have a couple properties that make them very useful for what we want. So, the first one being, if you have the same input, it will produce the same output every time. But if you change anything about the input, even if you just change a single character, then that output hash will be entirely different. And then the most important feature is that these cryptographic hash functions are one-way, meaning that if you take that output hash, there's no way to figure out what input was used for that output hash. And so what this enables us to do is we can hash down a document, and then we can take that hash of the document, include it in a Decred transaction so that it gets picked up and included on the Decred blockchain. And then at any point in the future, if we want to check and see if this document has been changed at all, we can just rehash the document and compare the output hash to the hash that's included on the Decred blockchain, right? So it gives you a cryptographically verifiable way to ensure the authenticity of data over time. And so this is essentially what DCR time does. It automates this process. Now, if you had to send a Decred transaction for every single document that you wanted to authenticate, then that could get incredibly expensive. And so DCR time uses a data structure called a Merkle tree, which is essentially a way to take a whole bunch of hashes and reduce them down to a single hash. And the way it does that is it will take two hashes at a time, combine them together, run them through the hash function, so you get a single output hash. So you just turn 2 hashes down into a single 1 hash, and you just keep doing that until you're left with just what's called the Merkle root. That's the single hash at the very top of this tree-like structure, and then you can take that Merkle root, include that in the Decred blockchain, timestamp it onto the Decred blockchain, and at any point in the future, if you want to verify the authenticity of any of the documents that were used in that Merkle tree, you take what's called the Merkle path and the original document, and then you can do that. You can verify that it hasn't changed at all. And so this is what cryptographic timestamping is. This is what DCR time does. It automates that whole process and is a core component of Politeia. So now getting into the actual Politeia architecture. So we have a 2-tiered architecture. We have the Politeia daemon and the Politeia www, which is the public API and the user layer. So I'll start with the Politeia D, which is the Politeia daemon, and you'll see it on the left-hand side of the screen. So the core functionality of Politeia D is to act as a document store for proposal data. So it allows you to submit proposals, it tracks the changes of those proposals over time, and it uses DCR time to periodically timestamp all of the data onto the Decred blockchain. So Politeia D is not exposed to the internet, but it does have an API that allows Politeia www to interface with it. And when you submit a proposal, proposals are categorized into as being either vetted or unvetted. So a vetted proposal is just a public proposal, a proposal that has been submitted and has been made public, while an unvetted proposal is a proposal that has been submitted but is not public yet. And these two categories, vetted and unvetted, have two Git repositories on the back end that correspond to those proposals. And so when you submit a proposal, Politeia D will create a new folder in the unvetted repository. It will add the proposal data to that folder, and then it will create a commit and commit those changes to the Git history. So if you're familiar with Git, then you may know that each Git commit has a commit hash associated with it. And that commit hash is essentially a representation of all of the files in their current state in the repository at that point in time. It's very similar to how a Merkle root is a representation of multiple files. You can condense them down to a single Merkle root and then use that to prove the authenticity of them. Very similar with the Git commit hash. So when we want to timestamp all of this data onto the blockchain, instead of having to hash all the documents ourselves, we just take that Git commit hash, because Git has already done all the work for us, and we use that to timestamp that onto the blockchain. So every hour we periodically will take all the recent commit hashes, we'll create a Merkle tree, Merkle them down, get the Merkle root, send that off to DCR time, and we'll get back some data from DCR time, the transaction ID of the Decred transaction in which the data was timestamped onto the blockchain, the Merkle root from DCR time, and the Merkle path. We'll then commit that data to the repository. And so this creates a time ordering that is computationally infeasible to recreate, and it allows anybody to independently verify the authenticity of all of the proposal data. So like I said earlier, everything is regularly backed up to a public GitHub repo. So all of the data is available for anyone to verify themselves if they so choose. So the fact that we're already using Git on the back end makes this whole backup process pretty easy, since the vetted repository is just a Git repository that we can just push off to GitHub. So that's the core functionality of Politeia D, and we built it in a modular way. All of the Decred specific functionality we packaged up into a Decred specific plugin, and this is so that if anybody wants to take Politeia and use it as their own type of document store that's automatically timestamped onto a blockchain, they can do so, and all of the Decred specific functionality is pretty easy just to pull out, and they can make their own plugins that integrate with this Politeia D backend. So for the Decred specific stuff, like tallying votes, getting comments, and comment upvotes and downvotes, that's all packaged up in that Decred plugin, and we don't make a commit for every action that's taken. Using Git is pretty expensive, especially Git commits, right? It performs a bunch of work every time you make a commit. And so what we do is we use a journal structure where every action that's taken, anytime a vote is cast, a comment is made, or a comment is upvoted or downvoted, we'll include that into the journal, and then we will periodically take everything in the journal and then commit it to the repository. So it's just a lot more efficient performance-wise to do that. So the last thing that I wanted to mention about Politeia D is the identity of the server. So the first time that Politeia D is started up, it generates a public-private key pair. And that becomes the identity of that Politeia instance, and any data that's submitted to it, it will sign that data with its key pair and send it back, and that's how it creates a censorship token, which I'll talk about in a few minutes about specifically what those are and what they're used for. Okay, so moving on to our public-facing API. So Politeia www, this is the user layer and the public-facing API. So this is where all the user data is stored, and this is what the Politeia GUI interacts with. So when you create an account on Politeia, you will have a user identity created for you, meaning in the browser, it will create a public-private key pair, and that will become your identity. So anytime that, as a user, you submit a document, you submit a proposal, submit a comment, upvote a comment, every action you take is signed by your identity. And so everything on Politeia, the origins of everything is cryptographically verifiable in this manner. And the user identity adds a bit of a user UX challenge, right? Now users have this key pair in their browser that they can get cleared out. Maybe they switch browsers, they move from mobile to desktop. And so if they do lose this key pair, it's not that big of a deal. As long as they still remember their password, they can just log in and generate a new identity for themselves. And we do store the history of all their public keys just so that we have that and can associate old comments, old proposals with a user identity. So another key part of the www layer is our paywalls. So we have paywalls, a user registration paywall, and then a proposal fee paywall. So this is largely a spam prevention measure, or for user registration fees, it's largely a way to prevent sock puppet accounts. When you sign up for a Politeia account, right now the fee is 0.1 Decred, which is about $5. And then if you want to submit proposals, you have to purchase what we call proposal credits. So again, the fee is just 0.1 Decred, which is just around $5 right now. And it's just, like I said, a spam prevention measure. So if you're a user and you submit a proposal, that proposal will not be public until it's approved by an administrator. So the role of an administrator is not to judge the quality of proposals. It is to simply make sure that proposals adhere to the proposal guidelines. It's not ads for something. They have the required information that proposals need, and they just follow the Decred guidelines, essentially. So once an admin approves a user's proposal, then it will become public, and it will be open for community feedback. So it's a very similar Reddit-like style where community members can comment, you can upvote, downvote comments, things like that. The proposal author can edit their proposal, incorporate feedback from it, and they can edit it as much as they want. And then when they're ready for the voting period to start, the proposal author will authorize a vote. And this is essentially saying that I'm the author of this proposal, it's in its final state, and an admin can start the voting process and have the community vote on this proposal. So once an admin starts the voting process, then it gets kicked off. The duration for right now, default duration is 1 week, but these aren't fixed numbers. A lot of the finer details of the Decred governance model are still being figured out, and a lot of the processes and procedures around Politeia are still being kind of worked out as we go along. So right now it's 1 week, but that could be variable in the future. So last thing I want to talk about is censorship tokens. So anytime a user submits, whether it be a proposal or a comment, they are given a censorship token from Politeia. And this is essentially, the server will take whatever they submitted, sign it with that server identity, and send it back. And it's a way for the user to cryptographically prove that I submitted this data, and here's my censorship token to prove so. So if an admin censors a comment or censors a proposal and the user thinks that they were unfairly censored, they can then take that censorship token as proof of what they submitted and then open up a dialogue with the community. I don't think I should have been censored. This is what they said, and I think I was wrongfully censored. So what we're trying to prevent here is not all censorship. This platform has to be somewhat regulated, but what we're trying to prevent is silent censorship. So if there is an occurrence of censorship from an admin, the user always has recourse and can open up a dialogue with the community. So voting. Unlike Decred's on-chain voting, all Politeia votes are off-chain votes. And one ticket in Politeia is one vote. One ticket is one Politeia vote. So there are a couple ways to vote. You can use the Decred desktop wallet. So this was built, the ability to vote was built directly into the Decred desktop wallet, Decrediton. It has a governance tab. You can view the proposals, and it will essentially create the votes, sign them with the private key that is corresponds to the ticket, and then it will send those votes up off to the Politeia instance. Now, votes are not associated with any specific user account, and this is for privacy reasons. And we also have a command line tool where if you want some increased privacy, it allows for routing your votes through Tor, and then also, instead of having to cast your votes in one big block, you can trickle them in over a set duration, 24 or 48 or however long you want. So that's voting. Okay, so moving on. So the trade-offs that we made with this system, it has a lot to do with basically user experience, right? We're able to make all the data versioned, all the data cryptographically verifiable, and all the data transparent, but at a cost. And this is this is a very common occurrence in the space that we're in, is that in order to get these properties, you have to give up some user experience. So Politeia is not going to be as performant as a normal web app. Using Git on the back end is very expensive performance-wise. And then giving a user a public-private key pair that they now have to manage in the browser creates some user experience challenges. Your desktop, your browser storage can be cleared. Switching between mobile and desktop can be a problem. So, if you go to decredproposals.com, it may look like a normal website, but it's very different on the back end. The performance is not going to be the same as a standard web app. And your user experience is going to be a bit more challenging, but that doesn't mean that we're not focused on providing the best user experience we can. It's just going to be a bit harder. It might take us a little bit longer to work out some of these kinks. So future enhancements. In the near term, we just released V1, and there is quite a bit of low-hanging fruit that we can take care of in order to increase performance, take care of some of these UX issues. So over the next couple months, that's what we're going to be focusing on. And also, like I said, Decred's governance process is still being defined as we go. And so Politeia will be incorporating a lot of feedback from the community and evolving the system as we go along. So you can expect a lot of changes and a lot of the finer details to be worked out over the next few months, over the next year or so. Now, more long-term, we want to make Politeia less centralized, right? So right now, the Decred holding group is the entity that is running a Politeia server. But ideally, we'd have multiple entities all running Politeia instances that are kept in sync with one another. And then you also have things like, instead of just backing up to GitHub, which is a centralized service, you can back up to these decentralized storage solutions like IPFS, things like that. And then long-term, really, Politeia is the next step in the way to making Decred a full-on DAO, right? Where we have this network treasury and it is managed in a completely autonomous way by the Decred stakeholders. So in order to do that, we're going to need to essentially turn the network treasury into a smart contract and automate the process of dispersing funds and things like that. And once you have all that technology developed, it gets pretty interesting because The network treasury, it's just a normal multi-signature wallet, right? There's nothing special about it. And so you can take all of the technology that we're building for managing the Decred DAO and essentially apply it to any other DAO that wants to run on top of Decred, right? So for our Politeia instance, we take into account all 41,000 tickets in the ticket pool. But if you want to run your own DAO on top of Decred, you could potentially just whitelist a small number of addresses and only count those votes in your Politeia instance. And you get all of that essentially for free. The only cost to you is just holding enough Decred to continually purchase those tickets, however many voting tickets that you want. And so at that point, you can start thinking of Decred more of as a governance platform as opposed to just a cryptocurrency that is focused on governance. And so that's when things start getting really interesting, but that's a little ways off still. All right, I believe that is the overview of the Politeia architecture, and I wanted to open it up for questions.
First, let's get Luke another hand of applause. Yeah, that was awesome, Luke. In exactly 20 minutes, you're the only one who has been able to do that. Who's got a question?
So have you guys solved your, found a solution for the query layer, you guys, in your system?
What data are you querying?
Well, in reference, you guys you have a storage layer, so you have your database. You're obviously going to want to query the full Decred blockchain and have, whether it's queries at particular points in time, you want the state of the Decred chain at any given point in time. Do you guys have a query layer? Did you guys build your own infrastructure around indexing the chain, or?
Yeah, so we are building our own block explorer. Yeah. That is DCR data, and our Politeia instance interacts with, right now it's the DCR data server, but we can run that locally as well to kind of speed things up if we want to. But yeah, we do have our own projects for querying the Decred blockchain. Okay,
and is that highly performant? Is it centralized? Can you talk about the characteristics of?
So the lead DCR data developer is here at this conference. I wouldn't really be the one to talk about the specifics of it. He gave a talk earlier today, but we can definitely get you in touch with him, hook you up if you have specific questions.
And I guess, is there from a high level perspective, are there high level plans for DCR data so if you're having DAOs built on top of you, for DCR data to be interoperable with other data stores across other different blockchains, in case people want to integrate multiple pieces for their DAO?
So I can answer a little bit of that. So the DCR data does implement the Insight API. So it is mostly compatible with some other systems out there. Any other questions?
Thanks. How much emphasis are you placing on having other DAOs use this as a platform, or is that just something that people are free to kind of pick up and do on their own?
So that's a long ways off, essentially. We still have a long road to get to the point where that is feasible or for other projects to actually start doing. So we haven't put too much thought into it yet, but it is the long-term possibilities of all the technology that we're building out can be used for other DAOs to run on top of Decred. There's no reason why they wouldn't, but it's still a long ways off.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
So how does the censorship dispute process work? So after my proposal gets censored and I put it in front of community, how does it work after that?
Sure. So this is one of those finer details that isn't quite, we haven't had any issues yet, so we haven't gone down this road yet. Just off the top of my head, somebody would probably open up go to another channel, whether it's Slack, whether it's Reddit, whether it's Twitter, and just start a dialogue with the community. This is what I submitted. This is my censorship token to prove this is what I submitted. I don't think I should have been censored, and just start a discussion and then go from there. If it came down to it, you could have, if the community was trying to establish some guidelines, you could put that into a proposal and have the community vote on it. Right? So Politeia can be used for not just things that need funding, it can be used to make any type of community decision.
Yeah, I was thinking it will probably be better if there's a formal process for it.
Right, and that's something that we very well may come up with in the near future, but we're still, yeah, it's still yet to be established.
So you know we're engineers, right? Write the code first. Deal with the problems later. Who's got another question?
Just curious if you're able to say how big the treasury is and at what rate would you disperse it for projects? Would it all be available at one time, or do you see it kind of a phased approach?
Yeah, so it would definitely be a phased approach. The treasury, it's just a normal Decred wallet address, so you can go and look at it yourself, but it's around, I think, 550,000 Decred, something like that. So I don't know how much that is in US dollar, somewhere slightly above 20 million maybe. But it will definitely be, the rollout of Politeia will definitely be done in phases. So right now, that network treasury is controlled by the team that launched Decred, and they still have veto power on anything that goes through Politeia for right now. Basically, if they think that it would be detrimental to the project, then they can still say, we're not going to honor a Politeia vote. I don't think that will necessarily happen, but it's until we have confidence, in this rollout, it will be done in tiered stages, and then slowly over time, it will be opened up to the entire network treasury.
Any other questions? All right, thanks, Luke.
Thank you.